Imagine living as a free man, a respected husband, father, and skilled violinist, only to be betrayed, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. This was the shocking fate of Solomon Northup, a man whose life took a tragic turn in 1841 when a promise of honest work lured him away from his family. Instead, he was chained, stripped of his identity, and thrust into a nightmare that would last 12 long years. Unlike many who were born into slavery, Solomon had tasted freedom. He knew what it meant to walk proudly in society, to earn his living, and to raise his children in peace. That freedom was violently stolen, replaced with beatings, forced labor, and the constant fear of death. But what makes Solomon's story unforgettable is not only his suffering, but his determination to survive and to one day return home. His memoir, 12 Years a Slave, published in 1853, exposed the brutal reality of American slavery in vivid, undeniable detail. It shook the conscience of a nation and remains one of the most important first-hand accounts of slavery ever written. This is not just the story of one man's survival. It is a testament to resilience, the fight for dignity, and the enduring power of truth. Join us as we uncover the incredible life of Solomon Northup, the free man who endured slavery, and the voice who made sure the world would never forget. In the early 19th century, the United States was a nation deeply divided, not just by geography, but by values, laws, and humanity itself. The northern states, though far from free of prejudice, had largely abolished slavery. In the towns of New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, African American families could live, work, and build lives outside the legal chains of bondage. Yet just a few hundred miles south, slavery remained the cornerstone of the economy, upheld by law, violence, and tradition. This contrast created a dangerous reality for free black men and women. On paper, freedom was their birthright, but in practice, it was fragile, vulnerable to the whims of racism, greed, and exploitation. Slave catchers and kidnappers prowled the streets of northern cities, looking for victims to sell into bondage. For the enslaved in the South, escape seemed nearly impossible. For the free in the North, freedom could vanish in an instant. It was into this world that Solomon Northup was born in 1808, in the small community of Minerva, New York. He was never enslaved. His father, Mintus Northup, had been manumitted, freed by his master, and Solomon inherited this legal freedom. But although he was free on paper, Solomon grew up in a society where laws and customs still treated black men as second-class citizens. Discrimination was constant, opportunities limited, and danger always close at hand. Despite these challenges, Solomon's childhood was not defined by despair. He was educated, unusual for many African Americans of the time, and he became known for his intelligence, work ethic, and especially his musical talent. He mastered the violin, and music became both his livelihood and his joy. By adulthood, Solomon was a respected member of his community, a farmer, a skilled craftsman, and a musician. He married Anne Hampton in 1829, and together they raised 3 children. To neighbors and friends, Solomon was a symbol of possibility, a black man building a good life through family, hard work, and talent. But beneath this hopeful image, a shadow loomed. In states like New York, African Americans could vote, own property, and run businesses. Yet racist laws and attitudes placed constant limits on how far they could rise. Worse still, the Fugitive Slave Acts and corrupt local authorities meant that free black people were never entirely safe. Kidnapping into slavery was not rare, and once taken, it was nearly impossible to prove one's freedom. Courts and slave markets often refused to believe a black person's word against a white trader's. Solomon knew these risks, but like many free black men, he lived with faith in his freedom. He had no reason to think his life would suddenly collapse. He was a family man, a musician hired to play at parties and events, a worker trusted by his community. He had every reason to believe the future would be secure, yet history was waiting with a cruel twist. In 1841, Solomon would be offered what seemed like the chance of a lifetime, a well-paid job as a traveling musician in Washington, D.C. But that opportunity would turn into a trap. Stripped of everything he knew, he would be cast into a world of chains, brutality, and survival. Before that betrayal, however, Solomon Northup's life stood as a powerful reminder of the fragility of freedom in America. He had the rare gift of living as a free man in a nation where millions of others remained enslaved. He had love, family, and dignity. But he also lived on a knife's edge in a country that had yet to decide whether liberty truly belonged to all. His story, and the tragedy that followed, would expose this contradiction to the world. By 1841, Solomon Northup's life seemed steady, even hopeful. He lived in Saratoga Springs, New York, with his wife Anne and their 3 children. He worked as both a farmer and a violinist, often hired to provide music at local gatherings. The violin was more than an instrument. It was his gift, his passion, and a way to earn extra income for his family. Solomon's talent was well known in his community, and it would ironically become the very skill that lured him into one of history's most shocking betrayals. That spring, Solomon was approached by 2 men who introduced themselves as entertainers. They claimed to be seeking musicians for a traveling circus. They spoke politely, dressed well, and seemed respectable. To Solomon, their offer sounded legitimate. It promised good pay for a short engagement in Washington, D.C., money he could use to support his family. The idea of adventure and professional recognition appealed to him as well, but there was a sinister undercurrent to their invitation. Washington, D.C., though technically home to many free blacks, was also a hub of the slave trade. The 2 men, later revealed as con men named Merrill Brown and Abram Hamilton, knew exactly how to manipulate Solomon's trust. They played upon his talent, his ambition, and his faith in the honesty of strangers. Eager for the opportunity, Solomon agreed. He did not tell Anne the full details of the trip, only that he would be away for a short while, performing music. He expected to be back within weeks, violin in hand, with new stories to tell and money in his pocket. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The journey began smoothly. Solomon traveled with Brown and Hamilton, performing along the way. They treated him cordially, and he had no reason to suspect the trap being laid. When they arrived in Washington, they even accompanied him to obtain official travel papers. These documents identified him as a free man, a safeguard he believed would protect him if questioned. Ironically, those papers would later disappear, one of many calculated steps in stripping away his freedom. On their final night together, the men invited Solomon to dinner. They shared food and drink, and he enjoyed their company. But something was wrong. The wine they offered was laced with drugs. Within hours, Solomon began to feel dizzy, his vision blurring, his body growing heavy. By nightfall, he was incoherent, staggering, and unable to stand. He thought he was ill. In truth, he had been poisoned. When he awoke, the world he knew was gone. Solomon found himself chained in a dark cell. His free papers, his clothes, and his violin, all gone. Panic and disbelief surged through him. He shouted that he was a free man, that he had proof, that this was a terrible mistake. But his cries fell on deaf ears. The kidnappers had succeeded in their plan. They had stolen not only his liberty, but his identity. To his captors, he was no longer Solomon Northup. He was simply another black man, a body to be sold for profit. The betrayal cut deep. For Solomon, freedom had always been his foundation, a certainty he had taken for granted. Now, in a matter of hours, that foundation had been ripped away. He would later recall the horror of that moment in his memoir, the disbelief, the rage, and the sheer helplessness of being reduced from a free man to property. From the jail, Solomon was moved in secret to a slave pen. There, he was beaten savagely until he stopped insisting that he was free. Every protest was met with the lash. Every declaration of his rightful liberty was silenced by violence. In the eyes of the traders, he was no different from any other captive. His past, his family, his name, erased by force. For Anne and the children, there was no word. Solomon had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only confusion and grief. For more than a decade, they would not know if he was alive or dead. The betrayal of 1841 wasn't unique. Hundreds of free black men and women were kidnapped and sold into slavery during this period. The system thrived on greed, corruption, and the ease with which white authorities dismissed the rights of black citizens. But Solomon's case would become one of the most famous, not only for the suffering he endured, but because he survived to tell the tale. This moment, drugged, beaten, chained in a Washington cellar, marked the beginning of his 12-year ordeal. A free man had been stolen into slavery. His journey south into the heart of America's most brutal system was only just beginning. Solomon's nightmare deepened as he was dragged from the Washington slave pen and forced onto a ship bound for the deep south. Shackled alongside other captives, he was now just one among many, stripped of identity, silenced by beatings, and marked as property. The ship itself was a floating prison, its hold crammed with men and women who, like Solomon, had been stolen into bondage. The journey was brutal. Disease spread quickly in the suffocating quarters. Chains rubbed raw against flesh. Fear and despair filled the air. Some prayed quietly for deliverance. Others wept in silence. For Solomon, the days blended into one long nightmare. He knew he was free, yet no one believed him. To his captors, his protests were lies. Every lash of the whip reminded him that his word carried no weight in a system built to erase his humanity. After weeks of confinement, the ship finally docked in New Orleans, the beating heart of America's slave trade. In the 1840s, New Orleans was one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the United States, a glittering hub of commerce powered by sugar, cotton, and human bondage. Along its bustling streets stood slave pens, auction houses, and markets where thousands of men, women, and children were sold like livestock each year. Solomon was herded into one of these pens. There, he saw the cruel efficiency of the trade. Captives were scrubbed, oiled, and displayed to appear healthy and valuable. Traders examined them like animals, checking teeth, prodding muscles, forcing them to perform small tasks. Buyers haggled over prices as if they were purchasing horses or cattle. Families were torn apart in front of him, children ripped from their mothers' arms, husbands separated from wives, never to be reunited. The dehumanization was complete. A person's worth was reduced to age, strength, and market demand. A child might be sold cheaply. A young man like Solomon, strong and skilled, commanded a higher price. To the traders, he was not Solomon Northup, a free man, a violinist, a husband and father. He was simply merchandise. Solomon would later write of this moment with searing clarity. The shock of watching families destroyed before his eyes haunted him as much as his own suffering. The catalog of human misery was then complete, he recalled. It was here, in the auction houses of New Orleans, that he grasped the full scale of slavery's cruelty. Soon, Solomon was put up for sale. He stood before potential buyers, forced to endure their stares and evaluations. His body was examined, his strength assessed. He was commanded to show his hands, to demonstrate his fitness for labor. Any resistance would have been met with violence, It was during this process that Solomon encountered William Ford, a Louisiana planter. Ford purchased him, and for a time, Solomon's fate seemed less brutal than that of many others. Ford, a Baptist minister, was regarded, at least in comparison to others, as a kindly master. But as Solomon would later reflect, even the mildest form of slavery was still slavery. No kindness could erase the chains that bound him or the family torn from him. As Solomon left the auction house with Ford, he stepped deeper into the world of Southern bondage. Behind him, New Orleans continued to pulse with its grim commerce, ships unloading Africans and free blacks kidnapped from the north, markets filled with buyers, and pens overflowing with human lives awaiting sale. The city was a paradox, rich, vibrant, and alive, yet built on human suffering. For Solomon, this was the beginning of 12 years of forced labor. The journey south had stripped him of his freedom, his dignity, and even his name. To the world around him, he was no longer Solomon Northup. He was simply Platt, a slave destined to toil on plantations far from the life he once knew. But deep inside, Solomon carried something his captors could not extinguish: the memory of freedom, the love of family, and the determination to endure until he could reclaim his rightful place in the world. When Solomon Northup was purchased by William Ford in 1841, he entered a new chapter of his captivity. Ford was a Baptist minister and planter in Louisiana. Compared to the brutality Solomon would later endure, Ford seemed almost humane. He was religious, soft-spoken, and, by the standards of the South, considered a kind master. But as Solomon would later emphasize, no amount of gentleness could erase the reality of slavery. Even under Ford's ownership, he was still property. A man robbed of his freedom, Ford recognized Solomon's intelligence and talents. He valued him not only for his physical strength, but for his skills as a carpenter and his ability to organize work. Solomon helped construct mills, canals, and buildings on Ford's land. In return, Ford treated him with a measure of respect, even giving him a Bible at one point. To some enslaved people, this treatment might have seemed a blessing, but Solomon saw it clearly. Kindness within a system of ownership was still a contradiction. Ford might not whip him savagely, but he still profited from his forced labor. During this period, Solomon's violin remained his companion. He played for Ford's family and for gatherings, the music a fragile connection to the life he had lost. The violin allowed him moments of dignity, reminders that he was more than just Platt, the name forced upon him. In the darkest hours, the notes he played carried memories of freedom, family, and love. Yet, even in this relatively gentle environment, Solomon's safety was not guaranteed. He soon fell under the supervision of John Tybeats, one of Ford's white overseers. Tybeats was everything Ford was not: cruel, petty, and violently temperamental. He hated Solomon's intelligence and resented his abilities. Every small act became a source of conflict. One day, Tybeats ordered Solomon to complete a carpentry task. When Solomon performed the work skillfully, but not exactly as Tybeats demanded, the overseer flew into a rage. He attempted to whip Solomon, but Solomon, unwilling to be humiliated, resisted. He fought back, wresting the whip from Tybeats' hand and defending himself. This act of defiance nearly cost Solomon his life. Tybeats, enraged at being overpowered by a man he considered property, plotted revenge. Not long after, he and 2 accomplices captured Solomon, tied a noose around his neck, and attempted to hang him from a tree. Only the sudden arrival of Ford's overseer saved Solomon from death. For hours, Solomon hung there in agony, toes barely touching the ground, the rope choking his breath. Other enslaved people looked on, unable to intervene, until Ford himself intervened to stop the madness. Ford, recognizing that Solomon's intelligence and defiance made him a target, decided to sell him. He claimed it was to protect Solomon from Tybetes' wrath, but in truth, it was another reminder that even a good master would trade human lives when convenient. For all his compassion, Ford still treated Solomon as a commodity. The sale marked a turning point. Solomon's years under Ford had been harsh, but survivable. Now, he would fall into the hands of one of the most notorious masters in Louisiana, Edwin Epps. The contrast could not have been starker. Ford, in Solomon's own words, was a kind, noble, candid man. But Epps was a brute. If Ford embodied the illusion that slavery could be tempered by kindness, Epps would reveal its raw, unrelenting cruelty. For Solomon, the transition was devastating. He had experienced enough to know that slavery had no safe harbor. Whether under a man who spoke gently or one who raged with violence, he was still bound by chains, still separated from his family, still denied his humanity. The years with Ford left a mark, though. They showed Solomon the contradictions of a society that claimed Christian values while profiting from bondage. They also gave him strength, a period where his talents as a carpenter, his resilience, and his refusal to be broken were tested and proven. These qualities would be his shield in the horrors to come. Leaving Ford's plantation, Solomon could not know the suffering that awaited him, but he carried with him the same determination that had carried him this far: the refusal to surrender his identity, his memory of freedom, and his hope of one day returning home. When William Ford sold Solomon Northup to Edwin Epps, Solomon entered the darkest and most brutal chapter of his 12 years in slavery. Epps was not merely a harsh master, he was infamous for his violence, drunken rages, and cruelty toward those he owned. In Solomon's own memoir, Epps is described as a man who was a stranger alike to pity and to fear. Under his control, the fragile thread of dignity that Solomon had managed to hold on to would be tested to its breaking point. Epps owned a cotton plantation in Louisiana, and cotton ruled everything. The fields stretched endlessly, and the work was relentless. Enslaved men and women, including Solomon, were driven into the fields at dawn and labored until nightfall. There was no respite, no mercy. The heat was punishing, the labor backbreaking, and the overseers carried whips ready to strike at the slightest falter. Epps thrived on this cruelty. He believed fear was the only way to control people, and so he wielded violence like a weapon. Whippings were common, often administered for trivial reasons: a dropped basket of cotton, a slowed pace, a perceived attitude. At night, the enslaved were locked in small cabins, too exhausted to do more than collapse. And in the morning, the cycle began again. For Solomon, the years under Epps were a crucible of survival. He worked as hard as he could, but no amount of labor ever satisfied his master. When quotas were not met, lashes followed. When Epps drank, which was often, his temper grew worse. He beat his slaves savagely, sometimes without reason other than his own frustration. One of the most tragic figures on Epps's plantation was Patsy, a young enslaved woman who endured unspeakable torment. Patsy was strong, skilled, and productive, often picking more cotton than anyone else. Yet her excellence only fueled Epps's cruelty. He lusted after her, used her, and subjected her to jealousy and abuse from his wife. Patsy became the target of relentless beatings, a victim of both Epps's desires and his wife's resentment. Solomon witnessed Patsy's suffering with horror and compassion. In his memoir, he described her as the most wretched creature on the face of the earth. Her story became one of the most searing examples of slavery's dehumanization. A woman trapped between violence and exploitation, with no escape. One of the most harrowing incidents of Solomon's years under Epps involved Patsy. Accused of visiting a neighboring plantation to obtain a bar of soap, she was tied to stakes in the ground. Epps forced Solomon himself to whip her, threatening him with death if he refused. Solomon, trembling with fear and grief, delivered the lashes, though he tried to do so lightly. Enraged, Epps seized the whip and beat Patsy until her back was a ruin of blood and scars. The screams echoed in Solomon's memory for the rest of his life. This moment symbolized the cruelty of slavery at its core, the enslaved forced to harm one another, the destruction of solidarity through fear, and the stripping of humanity until only survival remained. For Solomon, it was a wound deeper than any physical scar, the torment of being used as an instrument of another's suffering. Yet even in this pit of brutality, Solomon resisted in ways both subtle and profound. He clung to his identity, never forgetting that he was a free man. He nurtured memories of his family, repeating their faces and voices in his mind so they would not fade. He maintained his skills, continuing to play the violin when possible, carving wood, and finding ways to remind himself that he was more than Platt, the name Epps used for him. He also resisted through intellect. Solomon observed, learned, and waited for opportunities. He studied the landscape, memorized routes, and paid attention to which white men might be sympathetic to his plight. Though escape seemed impossible, the swamps, dogs, and patrols made it nearly suicidal. Solomon never surrendered the hope of regaining freedom. The years under Epps were the hardest of his life. He endured whippings, hunger, exhaustion, and the constant threat of death. But he also bore witness. His memory, sharp and unyielding, became his shield. He knew that if he survived, he could tell the world the truth of slavery, not as an abstract debate, but as a man who had lived its horrors. In the broader context of American slavery, Epps represented the brutal reality that underpinned the Southern economy. While some, like Ford, cloaked ownership in a veneer of paternalism, men like Epps revealed the raw violence that slavery required to function. His plantation was not unique, it was typical. Cotton wealth flowed to markets in New Orleans, then to factories in the North and Europe, while the people who made it possible lived and died in chains. For Solomon, every day under Epps was a battle to endure without losing himself. He found small moments of strength in his fellow enslaved people, in music, in memory, and in faith. But the weight of violence pressed heavily. 12 years is a long time, and under Epps, each year felt endless. In the end, it was these years of brutality that made Solomon's story so powerful. His survival was not just physical, but spiritual. He endured a master who sought to crush him, yet he emerged with his dignity intact and his voice ready to expose the system for what it was. The nightmare of Edwin Epps's plantation would last for more than a decade, but as fate would have it, a chance meeting with a man of conscience, a carpenter named Samuel Bass, would finally offer Solomon the possibility of escape. In the long years of bondage, when hope seemed almost impossible, Solomon Northup found strength in one of the few things that could not be stolen from him: music. His violin, which had once filled the halls of Saratoga Springs with joy, now became both a tool of survival and a lifeline to his identity. Even on the plantation of Edwin Epps, where cruelty reigned, Solomon's music held power. The violin was a rare skill among enslaved people, and Epps often forced Solomon to play for his drunken gatherings and late-night dances. White planters and their guests would drink, laugh, and dance, while Solomon, still a slave, provided the soundtrack. To them, he was entertainment. But to Solomon, the act of playing meant something far deeper. Each note he drew from the strings carried with it memories of freedom. He thought of Anne, his wife, and their children. He remembered evenings at home, celebrations with friends, and the dignity of being respected for his talent. Music was the bridge between the man he had been and the man he was forced to be. It was a quiet act of resistance, a way to preserve his humanity in a world determined to strip it away. The violin also gave him small advantages. His ability to play made him valuable to his masters, sometimes sparing him from the harshest labor. It earned him brief moments of favor or lighter duties, but it also reminded him of the bitter irony of his condition. A free man's art turned into a slave's obligation. Beyond survival, the violin helped Solomon maintain his inner world. In the endless monotony of cotton fields and brutal punishments, music offered him a space where Epps and the overseers could not reach. When he played, even under duress, his spirit traveled elsewhere. Back to New York, to his family, to freedom. Music also connected him to others in bondage. For the enslaved, songs were more than entertainment. They were carriers of memory, coded messages, and expressions of endurance. Solomon's violin often accompanied their voices, binding them together in shared sorrow and fleeting joy. In those gatherings, even brief ones, they affirmed their existence as human beings, not property, but music alone could not shield him from despair. There were nights when Solomon looked at his violin and felt only grief. Grief for the years stolen, for the humiliation endured, and for the distance between himself and his loved ones. Yet he never abandoned it. To let go of the violin would have meant surrendering one of the last pieces of himself. Solomon's connection to music symbolized a larger truth about survival in slavery. The enslaved resisted not only through open rebellion, but through holding on to culture, memory, and identity. Songs, dances, stories, and crafts all carried fragments of freedom, even within captivity. For Solomon, the violin was his fragment, a reminder that though chains bound his body, his spirit remained his own. Years later, in his memoir, Solomon wrote of music with a mixture of sorrow and pride. It had been both his burden and his salvation. Forced to play for those who oppressed him, he turned that coercion into an act of endurance. Each performance was layered with irony, but also with quiet defiance, the reminder that he was not simply Platt, the name imposed upon him, but Solomon Northup, the free man who would one day tell his story to the world. Music did not free him from Epps's plantation. It did not end his suffering, but it sustained him through the endless years of cotton fields, whips, and tears. And when freedom finally returned, the violin was still with him, a symbol of resilience, memory, and the unbreakable core of who he was. For Solomon Northup, survival under Edwin Epps required more than endurance. It demanded cunning, patience, and the constant weighing of risks. He never forgot that he was a free man, but the challenge was how to prove it in a world determined to erase his identity. Escape was always on his mind, yet every attempt carried the threat of brutal punishment or death. The swamps and bayous of Louisiana were unforgiving. Runaway slaves who fled into the wilderness often perished from hunger, disease, or wild animals. Even those who managed to find their way north were hunted by dogs and armed patrols. The fugitive slave laws meant that capture was almost certain, and the penalty for running was savage. Whippings, mutilations, and executions awaited those who dared. Still, Solomon tried. He was intelligent and resourceful, and he looked constantly for opportunities. Early in his captivity, he attempted to send letters north. Using materials he secretly acquired, he wrote appeals for help, explaining who he was and where he had been taken. He entrusted one letter to a white man he believed might be sympathetic, but instead of delivering it, the man betrayed him to Epps. The discovery nearly cost Solomon his life. Furious, Epps confronted him. Solomon was stripped, tied, and whipped with merciless fury. Each lash tore into his back as Epps raged about the audacity of a slave daring to reach beyond his master's control. To Epps, Solomon's effort was not only disobedience, It was rebellion, and rebellion could not go unpunished. This beating left deep physical scars, but the emotional wound cut even deeper. Solomon realized that trust was a luxury he could not afford. One wrong move, one misplaced letter, could end his life. Yet he did not abandon hope. Instead, he grew more cautious, watching for a chance that would not betray him. Even when he did not attempt escape, Solomon endured the punishments inflicted on others. He witnessed enslaved men and women whipped until they collapsed, beaten for failing to meet impossible cotton quotas, or tortured for speaking out. The fear of punishment hung over every action, enforcing obedience through terror. Despite these dangers, small acts of resistance continued. Solomon used his carpentry skills to his advantage, sometimes negotiating with overseers for lighter duties or small favors. He found ways to communicate discreetly, sharing whispered encouragement with others. Resistance was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as refusing to let the spirit break, holding on to memory, identity, and hope. But the price of miscalculation was always high. For Solomon, the failure of his early escape attempts left him bruised and bloodied, yet still determined. He learned that survival required patience, waiting for the right moment, the right ally, the right opportunity. It would take more than courage. It would take timing and trust in someone beyond the plantation. The years dragged on. Each attempt at contact, each flicker of possibility, seemed to vanish in betrayal or danger. Solomon began to wonder if freedom was truly within reach, but deep down, he refused to accept that his fate was permanent. He had been born free. He had lived as a free man, and he carried that truth within him, no matter how many lashes fell across his back. The punishments were designed to destroy him. Instead, they hardened his resolve. Solomon would not risk reckless escape again. He would wait. He would endure. And when the right moment came, he would seize it, even if it meant putting his life into another's hands. That chance would finally arrive years later in the form of an unexpected ally, a white Canadian carpenter named Samuel Bass, whose conscience could not accept the cruelty of slavery. But before Bass appeared, Solomon had already proven one thing, that even in the face of brutal punishment and betrayal, he would never give up the belief that freedom was his right. After years of cruelty under Edwin Epps, when Solomon's spirit had been tested by endless labor and lashes, an unexpected figure stepped into his life. Samuel Bass, a Canadian carpenter. Bass was unlike anyone Solomon had ever encountered among Southern whites. He was outspoken, principled, and deeply troubled by slavery. In a land where the system was defended by law, tradition, and violence, Bass's refusal to accept its morality made him stand out like a flame in darkness. Bass had been hired by Epps to help construct new buildings on the plantation. Unlike Epps, who saw enslaved people as little more than animals, Bass treated them as human beings. He spoke to them with respect. He did not curse, whip, or demean. Most astonishingly, he openly criticized slavery, even in front of Epps himself. To the enslaved, Bass's words were extraordinary, rare glimpses of truth in a world built on lies. Solomon listened carefully. For years, he had searched for someone he could trust, someone who might help him. But trust was dangerous. He had been betrayed before, and the consequences had nearly killed him. Revealing his true identity could mean death if Bass turned out to be another deceiver. And yet, something about Bass inspired confidence. His manner, his convictions, his refusal to bow to the hypocrisy of slavery, all suggested that this man might truly be different. One evening, Solomon gathered his courage and confided in Bass. He told him his real name, Solomon Northup, not Platt. He explained that he had been born free in New York, kidnapped, and sold into slavery. For 12 long years, He had been trapped in this nightmare, waiting for a chance to prove who he truly was. Bass listened intently. He was moved, not only by the injustice of Solomon's situation, but by the broader evil of the system. He promised to help, but the risk was enormous. To assist a slave in reaching freedom was against the law. If discovered, Bass could be arrested, fined, or even killed by angry slaveholders. Yet Bass's conscience would not allow him to ignore Solomon's plea. Together, they devised a plan. Bass would write letters on Solomon's behalf, sending them north to people who might know him. Solomon gave him the names of friends and family in New York, including Henry Northup, a lawyer and distant relative of his father's former master. If the letters reached the right hands, there was hope. If not, Solomon's secret might bring ruin upon them both. Weeks passed in agonizing suspense. Solomon returned to the fields each day, his body aching, his back scarred, but his heart carried a new spark. For the first time in 12 years, there was real possibility. Bass had taken the letters, and with them, Solomon's fragile hope of rescue. Bass continued to visit and reassure him, though he was careful not to draw attention. Epps, oblivious, remained confident that his authority was unchallenged. He could not imagine that within his own plantation, the seeds of Solomon's freedom had been planted. As time went on, Solomon's faith in Bass deepened. Unlike others who had betrayed him, Bass never faltered. His willingness to risk his own safety for the sake of justice marked him as a rare ally in a world of oppression. For Solomon, it was a reminder that not all hearts were hardened by slavery, that there were still those willing to defy the system, even at great cost. The waiting was torturous. Solomon knew that letters could be lost, intercepted, or ignored. He had endured so many false hopes before, but this time felt different. This time, he had placed his trust in a man who had proven himself fearless in speaking truth. Finally, the day would come when that trust bore fruit. Word reached Louisiana that Henry Northup, armed with legal authority and determination, was on his way. The letters had arrived. Solomon's name, long buried beneath the false identity of Platt, had reached the people who could restore it. For 12 years, Solomon had survived through memory, music, and sheer willpower. But now, because of Samuel Bass, he had something more powerful than endurance, a real chance at freedom. The letters Samuel Bass had written carried Solomon Northup's name back to the world that had lost him. They traveled north, reaching the hands of allies who remembered the free man from Saratoga Springs. Chief among them was Henry Northup, a lawyer and distant relative of the family that had once enslaved and later freed Solomon's father. Henry knew Solomon personally and was outraged to learn of his kidnapping. With determination and legal documents proving Solomon's free status, Henry set out on the long journey south. In January 1853, Henry Northup arrived in Louisiana. For Solomon, still toiling under Edwin Epps, the day began like any other. He worked the cotton fields, shoulders bent, hands raw, the lash always hanging in the air. 12 years of slavery had taught him to expect nothing but toil and sorrow. He had nearly given up believing rescue was possible. That day, however, history shifted. Word spread that strangers had arrived on Epps's land with official papers. When Solomon was called forward, his heart pounded in disbelief. Standing before him was Henry Northup, a friend from his old life, a face from the world of freedom he had not seen in more than a decade. The moment was overwhelming. Solomon fell into Henry's arms, tears streaming down his face. At last, someone recognized him, not as Platt, the slave, but as Solomon Northup, the free man. The nightmare was ending. Epps, furious but powerless against the legal proof, raged at the loss of his property. For 12 years he had owned Solomon's body, but now the law declared otherwise. Henry Northup presented the manumission documents, backed by the authority of the state of New York. Reluctantly, Epps was forced to release Solomon. The chains that had bound him for more than a decade were broken in an instant. For Solomon, the reality of freedom was almost too much to grasp. He later recalled that he felt as if he were awakening from a long, dark dream. He had endured whippings, hunger, humiliation, and despair. He had nearly lost hope countless times. But now, after 12 years of bondage, he could walk away as a free man. The journey north was filled with anticipation and reflection. Every mile that separated him from Louisiana was a mile closer to family, to home, to dignity. Yet Solomon also carried with him the memories of those left behind. He thought of Patsy, of the men and women whose chains would not be broken, whose suffering would continue. His joy was tempered by sorrow, for his freedom was not theirs. When he finally returned to New York, the reunion with his family was almost beyond words. Anne, his wife, who had endured 12 years of uncertainty and grief, embraced him with tears of joy. His children, now grown, wept as they embraced the father they had feared, lost forever. Neighbors and friends gathered, astonished and moved. A man stolen away, thought to be gone, had returned. The emotional weight of the moment was indescribable. Solomon, who had been silenced for so long, could finally speak his own name without fear. He was not Platt. He was Solomon Northup, husband, father, musician, and free man. But Solomon's return was not the end of his journey. It was the beginning of a new mission. He knew his story was too important to remain private. It was not just about his suffering. It was about exposing the system that had stolen 12 years of his life and countless lives besides. With the help of abolitionist allies, Solomon wrote his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, published later that year in 1853. The book was an immediate sensation. It provided something few in the abolitionist movement could: the first-hand testimony of a free man kidnapped into slavery. His descriptions of auctions, plantations, punishments, and the daily lives of the enslaved were vivid, detailed, and undeniable. For readers in the North, many of whom had never seen slavery firsthand, Solomon's words brought the horrors into sharp focus. Beyond its role in the movement, 12 Years a Slave was also a deeply personal act of reclamation. By writing his story, Solomon seized control of his narrative. He declared to the world that he was not merely a victim of circumstance, but a witness whose testimony could help dismantle the very institution that had tried to erase him. The book sold thousands of copies and was translated widely. Solomon toured, speaking to audiences about his ordeal. His voice, eloquent and unflinching, added power to the growing call for abolition. Though the Civil War and emancipation were still years away, his testimony joined the chorus of voices pushing the nation toward reckoning. For Solomon, the return to freedom was bittersweet. He had regained his family and his life, but the scars, physical and emotional, never fully faded. He carried the memories of whips, chains, and cruelty until the end of his days. And though his own ordeal ended, millions remained enslaved. That knowledge weighed heavily upon him. Still, his rescue and return stood as a powerful symbol. In a world where so many stories of bondage ended in silence, Solomon Northup's ended in triumph. His freedom was not just his own. It was a testament to resilience, perseverance, and the unbreakable will to survive. When Solomon Northup walked back into his family's embrace in 1853, his personal ordeal had ended, but his mission had just begun. He had survived 12 years in chains, and now he was determined to ensure that the world knew the truth of what he had endured, not only for himself, but for the countless others who remained voiceless. With the help of abolitionist allies, Solomon dictated his experiences in meticulous detail. That same year, his memoir, 12 Years a Slave, was published. It was no ordinary book. Where many Americans treated slavery as an abstraction, Solomon's narrative made it real, visceral, and undeniable. He described the auctions in New Orleans, the cruelty of Edwin Epps, the cries of Patsy, and the despair of families torn apart. His words struck like lightning, exposing the system's brutality to a wide audience. The book became a bestseller, selling thousands of copies across the United States and abroad. In Britain, where abolitionists were still pressing for global change, Solomon's testimony was hailed as powerful evidence of slavery's inhumanity. His story added urgency to the debates raging in America, where tensions between North and South were reaching a breaking point. For abolitionists, Solomon was a gift. He was articulate, credible, and impossible to dismiss. Unlike some enslaved people, he had been born free, and that fact gave his story particular weight. He had lived both realities, freedom and bondage. No one could claim he was exaggerating. His life was proof that slavery was not just a Southern institution. It was a national crime that threatened every black person, free or enslaved. Solomon embarked on a lecture circuit, speaking to audiences about his experiences. Crowds listened in awe and horror as he recounted his kidnapping, the whip of Epps, and the resilience required to survive. His presence gave flesh and blood to the abolitionist cause. He was living proof of slavery's horrors and of the possibility of survival and redemption. Yet even as he gained recognition, Solomon remained deeply marked by what he had endured. The memories of whippings, chains, and cruelty never left him. The scars on his back testified to the violence he had suffered, and the faces of those he left behind, Patsy most of all, haunted him. His freedom was bittersweet, for he knew millions remained enslaved, and many would never live to see liberty. Over time, Solomon's life after the publication of his memoir became less clear. Some accounts suggest he continued to work with abolitionists, aiding freedom seekers through the Underground Railroad. Others suggest his later years were quieter, spent with his family in the North. The historical record fades, and his final years remain uncertain, but his impact was already assured. The legacy of Solomon Northup lies not only in his personal survival, but in his voice. 12 Years a Slave became part of the canon of slave narratives, alongside the works of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. These testimonies built the moral and intellectual foundation of the abolitionist movement, forcing Americans to confront the human cost of their peculiar institution. In the centuries that followed, Solomon's story was nearly forgotten. His book went out of print, and his name faded from popular memory. But history has a way of resurfacing truth. In the 20th century, scholars and activists rediscovered his narrative. By the 21st century, his story once again captured the world's attention. In 2013, the film adaptation 12 Years a Slave brought his memoir to global audiences, winning the Academy Award for Best Picture and re-establishing Solomon Northup as one of the most important voices in American history. Today, Solomon's life is studied not just as a tale of personal endurance, but as a mirror reflecting the broader realities of slavery. His testimony reminds us that behind every statistic, every millions enslaved, every thousands sold, was a human being with a name, a family, and a dream. His legacy also challenges us in the present. Slavery may have been abolished, but its echoes continue in racism, inequality, and exploitation. Solomon's voice calls across centuries, urging us to confront injustice wherever it exists. His life shows that truth, once spoken, has the power to shake nations and change history. In the end, Solomon Northup was more than a survivor. He was a witness, His 12 years of suffering became a weapon against slavery. His story, a torch that illuminated the darkest corners of America's past. When we remember Solomon Northup, we remember not only the cruelty of slavery, but the resilience of the human spirit. We remember a man who refused to be erased, who endured the unimaginable, and who returned to tell the tale. And we remember that his voice, like the music of his violin, still resonates, still stirs hearts, and still reminds us that freedom is worth fighting for.